final episode in this series of videos covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't watched the previous 11 videos, I'd recommend going to the YouTube channel #HisTV and watching those first. In today's video, we're going to have a look at the final point on the specification for this unit, looking at the rise of feminism in the 1960s and 70s. And we're going to answer the key question: how did the feminist movement develop in America in the 60s and early 1970s? Now, it's really important before we begin that we understand the term feminist or feminism and what that means. And put very simply, it is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. There are some misconceptions, particularly in our society today, about feminism and what it means. Some people kind of believe wrongly that it's the idea that women should be above men in society or have more opportunities than men. And that's not the case. When we're talking about feminism, we're just talking about the belief that there should be gender equality, equal rights and opportunities for men and women. Now, in this video, there are 5 key areas that I'm going to cover. We're going to start by looking at the origins of what's called the women's liberation movement. Liberation means freedom, so looking at the origins of the movement for women's rights and freedom. We're then going to have a look at an organisation called NOW, or the National Organisation for Women, and how their activism started to really organise this movement. We're going to have a look specifically at the fight for equal pay and the gender pay gap that exists in America to this day and in British society, but how a couple of laws back in the 1960s and 70s aim to address that. We're then going to have a look at 2 very important Supreme Court rulings and the challenges that led to in American society and some of the big questions it led to. And then finally, we're going to have a look at the opposition to feminism and explore both men and women who did not believe in feminism, and they believed it was either against their religious points of view or their moral and ethical points of view as well. Let's begin then by looking at the origins of women's liberation. If you think right back to our very first study in this unit on the 1920s, that's where women's liberation really begins in real terms. We've got the struggle for gender equality, which had been a very long and slow process, but American women did get the right to vote in 1920. Now, if we fast forward from the 1920s to the 1940s, during World War II, many women took on new jobs that had been traditionally done by men. If you remember back to my video on the impact of World War II, we looked at women working in munitions factories and particularly working on aeroplanes. And after the war, many women were not really willing to go back to their pre-war lives. They'd experienced more independence and more freedom, and they wanted something different. Now, in the 1950s, there was still this attitude that the woman's place was in the home. Now, this view was particularly strong in middle-class families living in the city suburbs, on the outskirts of cities, and their view really was that the man in the family should be the breadwinner, the person that goes out and works and earns the money. The woman should be in the home, looking after the household and raising children. But in the 1960s, that viewpoint started to change. The 1960s was a time of big attitudes changing. We saw the civil rights movement begin. People like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X challenged some of the really old traditional views on race and racism. We also had the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, challenging traditional views. And there was a very, very famous book published in 1963 that was one of the trigger points for the growth of the feminist movement. And that book was called The Feminine Mystique, written by a woman called Betty Friedan. And in that book, it encouraged women to break out of their limited home life. It talked about women being trapped in the home and being quite depressed as a result of that, and encouraged women to look for something more in their lives. Now, this book became a bestseller, and from this point onwards, the phrase women's liberation became widely used about women seeking their freedom. So that's the origins of the women's liberation movement. It was a movement that had been going for quite some time in America, but really gained momentum in the 1960s. And that momentum was sustained and maintained by a group called NOW, or the National Organisation for Women. So in 1966, Betty Friedan, the woman that published The Feminine Mystique, and a group of other women helped to set up this group, NOW, National Organisation for Women. And within just a few years, they had 40,000 members, mainly middle-class women. And they held conferences, they wrote to politicians, they organised very large demonstrations and strikes. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But crucially, they took companies to court who did not pay women equally. They put quite a lot of pressure on the American government to make legal change. Now, in its very first conference in 1967, it published what it called the Bill of Rights. And in that, it called for new laws to protect gender equality and to put an end to sex discrimination. They also called for better maternity leave rights so that women who were having babies could leave their job for a while and then return to that job at a later date. And also called for the right for women to control their reproductive systems, to be able to use contraception, to be able to choose to have an abortion if they wanted to. At this time, the government and the states controlled these things. Now, by the late 1960s, other groups of young women wanted to accelerate change by using more radical methods of protest. This is very similar to the Black Civil Rights Movement, where you had peaceful protest at the beginning, but people wanting change to happen more quickly as the movement continued. Now, these groups of younger, more radical women became known as the Women's Liberation Movement, or Women's Lib. So we've got several different groups of women at this time, all protesting and acting to try and achieve change for women. Now, during the 1960s, there was also a fight for equal pay. So in 1963, something called the Equal Pay Act was signed by the American government after a report that they did, which basically found that there was a massive gender pay gap in American jobs. They found that women on average earned 60% less than men for doing exactly the same work. And so in the Equal Pay Act, it stated that women should receive the same wage that men were paid for the same job. If a man and woman were to do exactly the same work, they should, of course, be paid the same. But although this act was a change to the law and said that people should be paid the same for the same job, in reality, a very large gender pay gap existed after this point in all professions. Now, during the late 1960s, many women used petitions, so that's collecting lots of signatures, and strikes, refusing to go to work, to persuade their employers to provide equal opportunities and pay, to try and make their employers put into practice the things that were put in the Equal Pay Act in 1963. In 1970, now the organisation that we've looked at just a minute ago organised the Women's Strike for Equality, which organised thousands of protests of women across America. So the movement was really growing and gaining momentum. However, in 1972, another amendment to the Constitution was put in place. Remember, that's just a change to the law. An amendment means a change, amendment to the Constitution. This was passed by Congress, by the American government, but not enough states in America voted for it, and it did not become law. There was still resistance in the American states to equal rights. And so, in reality, women's average pay remained well below that of men, and there was widespread sex discrimination in the workplace. So things were changing, but they weren't really changing very quickly. Now, we talked earlier about the National Organization for Women, and one of their key points was about women having or being able to have more control over their reproductive system, their choice to be able to use contraception if they wanted to, and to be able to have an abortion. So we're going to have a look at two Supreme Court rulings that dramatically changed some of these attitudes in American law. So to start with, in 1973, the Supreme Court, the highest court in America, decided that being able to have an abortion was a fundamental right for women in the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case. Now, the Supreme Court overruled, which means to get rid of, laws in many American states that either banned all abortion, so stopped abortion completely, or limited its use. And so after the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision, women were able to choose to have an abortion up until the end of their third month of pregnancy, what's known as the first trimester. Now, after that point, women were still able to have an abortion as long as it was approved by the state. But until that point, women could now choose to have an abortion. This was a dramatic change in the reproductive rights of women. Now, adding to that, in 1967, a women's rights campaigner, a man called Bill Baird, was arrested for giving contraception to an unmarried woman. And he challenged this case and eventually went to the Supreme Court. In many American states at the time, you were only able to access contraception if you were a married couple. If you were an unmarried couple, you couldn't. The thought being that giving contraception to unmarried couples encouraged premarital sex. Now, in 1972, the Supreme Court backed up some of the things that were established in Roe versus Wade by ruling that contraception should be freely available to unmarried couples. So unmarried couples should be able to get contraception on exactly the same terms as married couples. And again, that's another big change in the law in America. Now, these Supreme Court decisions and the feminist movement generally sparked these big moral and religious debates across the nation. Lots of people were talking about what is morally right and wrong and what is right and wrong according to God. And so big debates and conversations were being had in the 60s and early 70s about the morals and ethics of American society. So although we've seen the organisation of the feminist movement and we've seen some positive change in terms of the law for equal pay and gender equality, and particularly to do with women being able to control their reproductive system through Supreme Court rulings, there was significant opposition to feminism during this time. A range of people opposed these ideas and the decisions passed by the Supreme Court. The decision to legalise abortion and to give contraception to unmarried couples led to protests from anti-abortionists and people who argued that these laws just encouraged premarital sex. Not all women supported the feminist and women's liberation movements as well. Many women were quite happy with their status in society, especially those that lived comfortable suburban lifestyles. They were quite happy being at home. And a woman called Phyllis Schlafly led a successful campaign to stop equal rights laws, arguing that they would lead to more abortions and to gay marriages. Some of the things that the feminist movement was kind of putting forward really worried the American people, particularly conservative Americans. If you remember that word from before, conservative means kind of holding on to traditional values and being opposed to change. And Phyllis Schlafly, although she was a woman, get the pronunciation right, Phyllis Schlafly, although she was a woman, she did not buy into this idea of feminism. And in terms of religion, many religious groups, including men and women, use the words of the Bible to justify traditional gender roles of men being the kind of strong worker in the family, and women being the more gentle person that would raise the children and look after the house. So this was a time of some big discussions and some big questions in America about their morals and their ethics and what was right or wrong in terms of society and in terms of their religion. So there we have it. That's answered the question then, how did the feminist movement develop in America in the 1960s and early 1970s? We've seen the origins of the movement and how that developed and gained momentum through the National Organization for Women. We've looked at the fight for equal pay, but the reality that at the end of this period, there was still a very big gender pay gap. We've looked at two very important Supreme Court rulings on women's right to control their reproductive systems. But we've also had a look at the opposition that led to and general opposition to feminism. I really hope you've enjoyed this series and hope it's been helpful. Thanks for watching.